Hello and welcome. My guest today is Andrij Dobrianskj, Director of Communication at the Ukrainian Congress Committee of America. Andrij, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, and good to see you again.
Yeah, good to see you again. We're watching this in real time right now. The Trump-Putin are on the phone. I'll be following the updates as they come in. But let's start here. What's your take on this call? Could it lead to anything positive at all?
The one thing we know for sure about a phone call with President Putin is that it will never start on time and it will always be late. But we know that they are talking right now. We have had that confirmed both from the Russian and the U.S. side. And we know that there have been several statements about the administration before then. We had a press briefing early in the morning, which is slightly different than their usual timing at the White House. They had an early morning press briefing where they mentioned the call, the fact that there will be a call, and that the president is interested. President Trump is interested in following up on taking the next steps for stopping the war. We also had some remarks by J.D. Vance regarding Putin and Ukraine, characterizing the situation as an impasse, so that from his perspective and perhaps other people in the cabinet, there might not be a way forward at the current state, especially after what we saw last week. I think last week was yet another instance where the United States government jumped ahead, specifically President Trump. He jumped ahead with his personal feelings and thoughts, and he derailed what could have been a positive development by the coalition of the willing into the situation in Istanbul, which never had any real chance of going forward.
Now, here's what's worrying people in Kyiv. There's a fear that Trump and Putin might agree on their own version of a peace deal and try to push it on Ukraine, without Ukraine at the table. Is that a real possibility? Could that actually happen?
Anything could possibly happen with President Trump. He likes to throw things away. However, the one thing that doesn't bode well for President Putin is that we do know that Steve Witkoff has put together a framework for how a peace deal would go forward. And we do know that President Putin and his team do not agree with anything in that framework. So if President Trump were to agree on something with President Putin, he would be throwing away the framework, in a sense, ceding to the Russian demands. I think all we've seen since this process began after the inauguration is a lot of ceding to Russian demands, even kicking out the presence of Marco Rubio or any U.S. delegation to take part in Istanbul. The further this goes on, the less interest America has going forward, and that was underscored by Marco Rubio in the last 24 hours and J.D. Vance. The United States is not interested in being strung along.
Some say Trump's been building pressure ahead of this conversation. The U.S. just approved Australia sending tanks to Ukraine. Lindsey Graham's been all over the place with new sanctions, and Trump remembers him well. Do you think this was Trump's way of signaling something to Putin before the call?
I don't think it's really the work of President Trump. Again, last week we had the visit by the four leaders from the coalition, the willing. They coordinated with President Trump when they were in Kiev. They and Zelensky called President Trump, explained what was going to happen. We're going to announce sanctions on Monday. They were hoping that the United States can work out their sanctions as well. President Putin has a late night press conference, and almost immediately President Trump tweets out that he would like to see President Zelensky take part in this. This is not the plan. And so again, one party, the United States, quickly jumping out and not taking part in a coordinated, concerted effort to pressure President Putin. At this point, we are back to square one, where we once again have to gather our allies, agree to a plan. But this time, the United States and President Trump cannot jump out ahead and demand this and that. There needs to be a coordinated effort. I hope that means that we see European sanctions this week. I hope that means that not only does the Senate take up Lindsey Graham's bill, but that we get some movement possibly in the House by at least one or two congressmen proposing a timeline for when we would have that legislation voted on in the House of Representatives.
Now there is talk of a possible face-to-face meeting between Putin and Zelensky after this call. Trump's people say they hate each other. Those are their words. Do you believe that meeting could actually happen, or it's just a noise?
I believe that President Zelensky is ready to have a meeting, but the question is Putin too scared? Is Putin unable to have a meeting while he's still planning an active military engagement against Ukraine? And this goes against the rhetoric by Russia for the last several months, where they do not consider President Zelensky to be a legitimate president. So to have a meeting would go against that rhetoric. And it's possible that President Putin will never have a meeting until such time that there is real damage witnessed on the battlefield. That was something that Congressman Ted Lieu spoke about yesterday in the United States, that he doesn't believe that Putin is ready to have serious conversations until some level of defeat is enacted against him with the help of European allies to the armed forces of Ukraine.
I looked just now, Vance said during today's call, Trump will ask Putin if he's seriously about peace. But what if Putin isn't serious about peace?
Oh, Putin isn't serious about peace, and Putin is going to try to do what he did last week. So not only was President Trump the one who jumped on and breaking the coalition's plan, but Putin successfully figured out a way of delaying sanctions, if just for a week. They were announced that on Saturday that the sanctions would come on Monday, and Putin successfully was able to drag that out by saying, "Well, maybe I'll have a meeting with President Zelensky," and then the Europeans agreed not to put on sanctions until that happened. Putin is going to figure out different ways of delaying the inevitable, and that has been his success throughout this entire war. Everything that the West has done, because of this democratic alliance, has been slow, and Putin is able to manipulate different tensions among different allied partners to slow things down even more.
Meanwhile, Senator J.D. Vance made headlines today saying the talks are at a dead end, as if they weren't already stalled. But he went further, saying the U.S. might walk away from this war altogether. How serious should we take that? Is it just rhetoric or a real shift in tone?
I think that we've heard that from Marco Rubio from the very beginning of this administration, that the United States is willing to walk away. We heard something more definite about that a few weeks ago when the United States said that they're not willing to fly around the world, that they're done with this. We also know that Steve Witkoff is done with meeting with President Putin until something concrete is on the table. Steve Witkoff will only be dealing with Iran at this point. To work forward on that agreement. So there are already some parts of the United States diplomacy that is pulling away from doing diplomacy in terms of trying to foster some talks. But at the same time, we have the positive steps are that we saw, as you mentioned, the tanks from Australia, the authorization for Ukraine to be able to purchase weapons. There are additional ways of supporting Ukraine that could come back online to arm Ukraine, as opposed to focusing solely on this dream of a diplomatic solution to this, which, as many experts are saying, is the Russians are not ready for this. And frankly, Russians are delaying until they can have another further ground invasion of not just the 4 territories they want, but possibly the 2 territories that they threaten to take.
And then there is this, Trump says he's disappointed, but Finland's President Alexander Stubb saying that Trump anger, especially toward Putin, could actually be a good thing. Do you think Trump is finally waking up to what Putin really is, or is just politics as usual?
I will go back to the phone call in March where the White House and President Trump were very disappointed, some would say angry, at the fact that they had announced a press conference where Trump would come out after the call with Putin to say that he had come to some kind of agreement. And he realized during that call, President Trump realized that President Putin was not interested in making a deal. And they have tried subsequently to get engaged again. But it's true that they are disappointed with the fact that President Putin simply won't agree to the terms laid out by President Trump. And so they are disappointed or angry, whichever you want to say. However, the one thing about President Trump is he is not an ideological person. He held grudges and been upset with people over the years? Absolutely. Has that prevented him from working with those people within the next 24 hours? Absolutely not. People can say that President Trump was angry at Ukraine numerous times. And then within the same week, we saw this last year when President Zelensky came to visit the United States. Tucker Carlson tried to make a big conspiracy theory that President Zelensky was in being involved in the elections. And within a week, President Trump and President Zelensky were meeting with each other. So it doesn't matter if President Trump gets upset at Putin, because we know that within a matter of days, he can change his mind and go right back to working with him.
Mm-hmm. Do U.S. warning about leaving the peace process still matter?
I think that the major thing is that President Trump or Marco Rubio and the entire administration are not willing to sit down with them. They have an enormous amount of international deals they want to accomplish, especially specifically on tariffs and trade. And if there is no, if Russia is just being a wall that will not change, then they will focus on having these conversations with other nations. And we've seen that in the Marco Rubio visiting Caribbean nations, visiting, having a deal with Rwanda and Congo. They want to accomplish things, and working with a partner that is not interested in making a deal like Russia, that's not going to add anything to their successes. They want to see success.
Mm-hmm. Looking ahead, some people are now floating the idea of a Trump-Putin summit if the war ends. Do you think that's realistic? Would Trump actually sit down with Putin again?
I think President Trump is going to still try to sit down with President Putin. I don't know what the context is. I do not anticipate that this will happen before the NATO summit. I believe that the NATO allies want to have a sit down in person with President Trump first and discuss a way, just like the coalition tries to put down a plan of how are we going to together confront this problem, because no one president, no one nation can solve this problem. It has to be a coalition.
Mm-hmm. And if that meeting does happen and Trump shares a stage with Putin, would that be a blow to democracy, not just in the US, but globally?
I think President Trump has shown that he is willing to stand on stage with anybody. We saw that in the first administration, standing with Putin. We saw that in his meetings with Kim Jong-un. This is just who he is. He's willing to sit and talk with anybody. Whatever he may have said about the current leadership of Syria, he seems fine with working with them. He might even stand with the leadership of Iran if there's a deal. So there are no limits to who he will stand with, so long as he is able to say, I accomplished something. This is a plus. Let all of history know that I was the only president who was able to make a deal like this.
Appreciate it, Andrij. Great having you with us, and I'm still waiting our conversation in the future.
Thank you so much, and I'm glad to be back on anytime you want me.
Thank you.